Janet.
Sorry, could you hear me? I know we broke up in the middle somewhere.
Have any of us ever seen fossil collectors at work? You know what I mean? People who go around digging in the earth trying to find fossils. Well, having been unwell as I was over the last couple of months, I've probably watched more daytime television than I've watched in my life. And to be perfectly honest, I really wouldn't recommend it to anybody. And during that time, I did see a programme where they were digging for fossils. They were in what seemed to me to be quite a nice location. It seemed to be where they were digging. There was fabulous scenery. It looked an interesting place. I wanted to know a bit more about it, but I couldn't, because the camera was zooming in on these people who were digging for fossils, and they were totally focused on the little 6-inch square bit of the earth. And as they focused down, they were not noticing all that was around them. And I would have liked to have known the landscape, a bit about what's going on around there, the culture, the people. Couldn't see any of that. Totally blinkered vision, totally focused down. Now, of course, the things that come out of the ground are of value. They're of interest. They tell us a bit about the place. But I very much got the impression that it was really focused down and you couldn't see anything else. Why do I share that this morning? Well, because it illustrates the point that focusing on a little bit of history can cause us to miss the bigger picture. And that's exactly what was going on in this passage of ours this morning from John chapter 7. It was the Feast of Tabernacles, is how I've always thought of it, always known it. Our translation of the Bible calls it the Festival of Shelters. Basically, it was a 7-day festival feast held at the end of the first harvest every year in Judea. And it was a time when the people of Israel looked back and remembered the first harvest that they'd experienced when they came out, having come out of Egypt and spent 40 years in the desert. When they entered into the promised land, they had their first harvest, and that was established. That's what they looked back to. And the focus of it was just looking back, recognizing and giving thanks for God's great provision. For those of us, and most of us know, the people had been in Egypt for about 400 years as slaves. God had brought them out in a miraculous way. They went for 40 years through a wilderness. During all of those 40 years, God had provided for them. He'd led them. By night, he led them by a pillar of fire, if you like, the light leading the way. He provided for them food. As we know, they were fed by manna, but they also provided, maybe more miraculously, water. Water in the wilderness. For 40 years, it never failed. God always provided them with water. And that was the festival where the biggest festival in Israel, where they looked back and gave thanks for that time. This particular year, we're told of 3 different groups who were there. There were Jesus' brothers, and we're told in the passage very clearly that at that time, Jesus' brothers didn't believe in him. And they said to him, you say you can do these miraculous, wonderful things. Why don't you go down to the festival and show everybody? That's the place to really let people be known. So there were the brothers there who didn't believe. Then there was the crowd. Now the crowd, they didn't quite know what to make of Jesus. There was certain confusion, clearly. They had questions. Some of them thought he was a good man. Others thought he was a fraud. They weren't certain, so they wanted to know. And what's very clear from this passage is from verse 14 onwards, Jesus took the time to answer their questions, to talk to them. It's something we see throughout John's Gospel. Jesus is always willing to answer the questions of people. Maybe they don't believe, maybe they've got real doubts. Jesus will give them time, and he did. And in a sense, he still does today. Jesus teaches, Jesus is happy for time to be taken. He teaches through teachers in the church and other places. He teaches through evangelists. Often he teaches us actually through the stories of others who've come to faith and have experienced God's goodness in their lives and the ways in which they've seen it. That tells a story. It's one we should never forget. Jesus is always willing to give time to those who've got genuine questions. So we've got the brothers, we've got the crowds. But the big focus of this chapter is on what is called in our version, the Jewish leaders. The Jewish leaders. Now, these were the religious leaders in Israel of the day, and quite clearly, they were hostile to Jesus. There's no question about it. Outwardly hostile. These people, yet they had a faith, they had a belief in God, but they become the radicals. They were full of zeal. These were the religious extremists. And what we see very clearly stated in our passage is that they were determined to kill Jesus. Why? Well, their mistake is that they were too focused on the past, too focused on the history, too focused on the tradition. If you like, try and think of them as the fossil hunters. Jesus is there, but no, they're focused down. They're focused on the minute. They actually focused for the law. They saw those rollers to strive to make sure that the law was fully kept, fully understood, and they narrowed their focus down onto that. They were focused on the history, all looking back rather than looking now. And they were focused on traditions. Because they had such a striving for the law and such a focus on history, they built a whole range of traditions around them that had to be kept. And the outcome of it was that they missed the key point, that all of these traditions and the law and the history of Israel was all pointing to one who was to come, Jesus himself. And they were so busy looking back and focusing on the minute detail that they didn't see that the one that all these things pointed to was now there amongst them. They totally missed the point. If we'd look back in our Bibles to John chapter 5, there we would have seen that Jesus healed a paralyzed man. This man was paralyzed, Jesus healed him, but he'd done it on the Sabbath day. And for these religious leaders, the Sabbath day had to be kept holy, no work was to be done. Jesus healed this man. You would have thought as religious leaders, seeing a great and miraculous work of God, they'd have rejoiced. But no, they were focused on the back. They were blinkered vision. They were the fossil hunters, narrowed it down. Why? Why were they like that? Well, it's helpful to think about why the law was originally given to Moses. It was given, obviously, to teach people about God. One of the laws that was given was to keep a day holy, a Sabbath day. Now, these religious leaders had focused on That's what we must do. And they built a whole range of tradition to ensure that they did that. And they made lots and lots of rules. You mustn't do this and you must do that to keep to the law. The Sabbath must be kept. Why did God give the law of the Sabbath? Well, he gave it after the people had come out of Egypt, come out of slavery. As slaves, they didn't get a day off. Slaves do not get time off. So their life was 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. Their whole function was to work and to do the task of a slave. God brought them out of that. God gave them freedom. And to mark it, God had given a day and say, this day you will rest. If you like, it was a day that was a permanent reminder of God's goodness. That was the purpose. That was the reason that law of the Sabbath was given. Yet to these people, the fossil hunters, they missed the point. To them, faith had become a dead faith. It was just a set of rules focused on the history, missing the reality for now. And what we see in our passage is that Jesus used this Feast of Tabernacles, this festival of shelters, to really shine a light on God's true goodness. The one to whom all these things, the history and the law pointed, to focus on himself. If we were to read forward a few verses from those that Neil read to us, we'd come to verse 37, where it says this: on the last day, the climax of the festival, Jesus stood and shouted to the crowds, anyone who's thirsty may come to me. Anyone who believes in me may come and drink, for the scriptures declare, rivers of living water will flow from his heart. Jesus was pointing out that he is the one through whom God provides. Yet God was good. He provided water in the wilderness, but he's provided so much more in Christ. He's provided life-flowing water in him. Read on a bit more into the next chapter, chapter 8, verse 12. Jesus declares, I am the light of the world. If you follow me, you won't have to walk in darkness, because you will have the light that leads to life. Yes, in the desert, God guided his people, and he showed that he will guide his people by a pillar of light. But in Christ, we have real light. God, who is living, leads us and guides us. You know, Jesus' brothers were right. The festival was the place for Jesus to make himself known. And he did. Now this morning it's our communion service, and as we gather around the table, we rightly and properly look back, because that's why this ceremony was given, that we would remember Christ's goodness and all that he did for us on the cross. As we do that this morning, let's take this passage as a warning of how easy it is to focus on the minute detail and to miss the reality that we celebrate. Just think how much division, how much upset's being caused in churches by people saying, communion shouldn't be celebrated like that. It should be done in this way, doing this particular aspect. The tradition and the history, if we're not careful, can take over. We can become fossil diggers and miss the reality in which we're meant to rejoice. This morning we've sung and we will sing again. Why do we sing? We sing to worship God. Yet it's so easy to focus on the tradition. And we must sing these songs. We must sing in this way. And the blinkered vision, the scratching in the earth takes over. from the true purpose. I always say we are so blessed in St George's to have a fabulous building in which we worship. It's great. Let's make it our determination that it never becomes a place that is a burden, a place that becomes our focus. Let's just use it for what it is, an asset to be used for the glory of God. We stop and think about it. The big picture is who Jesus is, recognizing that, and recognizing all that he's done for us, which we'll do this morning as we gather around the table. As a church, as believers here in St George's, that must always remain our focus. Let's make sure that we never become fossil hunters, that we really focus on a true and a living faith.